In this module, we will discuss about body temperature regulation. Animal kingdom undergoes this regulation because the brain requires some kind of a control in order to allow other systems of the body to function properly. When it comes to human being, we call that body needs to maintain a gradient of internal body temperature and temperatures of the other regions of the body like skin, muscle, fat. Every area has got certain amount of temperature. So that becomes a gradient between the internal body and the temperature of the respective areas, and that needs to be maintained in order to achieve body thermoregulation. This module will include how the heat transfer takes place between human body and the environment. And finally, we maintain some amount of balance so that our internal temperature remains within a narrow range, let's say 37 degrees centigrade. That is why sometimes at a particular temperature we feel comfort or discomfort. If the conditions of the environment are not conducive to the human body, then we call it a discomfort, or if we can achieve a certain amount of convenient environment, we call it is a comfortable environment. If we look at the heat exchange, human body exchanges heat by various routes like convection, conduction, evaporation, or even respiration. By various routes, body transfers heat by the gradient from high to low, or even sometimes low to high. In this module, we will also discuss about the mechanism by which body temperature gets regulated. We also must understand that even in extreme situations, human being has the capability to adjust to the extreme situation, and that sometimes we call is acclimatization or adaptation. In case of hot environment, we normally call it heat acclimatization. In case of cold, we call it the cold adaptation. Let us begin with the body temperature behavior of the animal kingdom. Often you know that we call the cold-blooded animals or poikilotherms. Cold-blooded animals are essentially where the internal temperature gets influenced by the temperature of the surroundings. That means some reptiles, depending upon the temperature conditions of the environment, they gain heat or lose heat. Whereas in case of human being or other animals, we call the warm-blooded animal. That means they maintain a certain amount of body temperature within a narrow range. Human being is essentially a homeothermic animal maintaining body temperature at around 37 degrees centigrade. One should not make a mistake, 37 degrees is anything constant. It changes within a narrow range from 36.2 degree to about 37.2 degree. In our human body, we have got many orifices. So at different places we can put our thermometric devices, whether it is a mercury thermometer or any other temperature sensors. We should be able to measure internal temperature. One is the tympanic membrane. Tympanic membrane in our inner ear, which is close to the internal carotid artery. Often we call it the temperature that records the temperature of the blood, which is the internal body temperature. Tympanic membrane temperature is difficult to measure. That's why sometimes oral temperature can be measured, which is from the external auditory meters we can record. Forehead is very hot in comparison to all other parts of the body. That's why sometimes we call it the first approximation of the brain temperature. In case of other sites, most common site is the temperature when you put thermometer under the tongue, called the oral temperature. That means the temperature is close to the lingual artery that measures oral temperature. We can also put thermometer inside the esophagus, which is very close to the level of the heart. There are different kinds of radio pills available which can be swallowed, and temperature can be constantly monitored from the internal body, which we call it the esophageal temperature. I move on to other sites. Sometimes you must have seen that people put thermometer under the armpit, which is close to the subclavian artery. That is also one kind of a site from where temperature can be measured. And one can put thermometer inside rectum, and that is known as the rectal temperature. If we cannot do rectal temperature, the other alternative is if you put thermometer on the flowing urine, that will also read the body or core temperature. The lastly, most recent development is that we call it the transcutaneous deep body temperature, which is essentially a temperature probe is kept on any surface of the body externally. Let us say a temperature of that probe is about 35 degree. We know body temperature will not be 35 degree, but it will put that pad at the level of 35 degree and it gradually gains heat from the body. So 35 is gradually increasing, 36, 37. At one point of time, the external temperature and internal body temperature will have a zero gradient between the core and the skin surface where the probe is placed. And that zero gradient principle is nowadays used for various purposes. In our laboratories also, sometimes we use that method, which are much easier to do and fairly accurate to measure body temperature. I explained to you about the normal body core temperature, which is, let us say, 37 degrees centigrade. It can be 36.1, it can also be 37.1. So nothing is unusual. 1 degree change range is always possible. But if this temperature of the body for some purpose rises, let's say up to 39 degree, body may not be able to cope up with that situation, which we call as disabling temperature, or body is reaching to the critical thermal maximum. In many industrial situations, many sports events, one can reach a limit of tolerance at the level of 39 degrees centigrade. In some pathologic conditions like fever and etc., the body temperature can also go up to 41 degrees centigrade. That often we call the fetal, because in our body we have got proteins, enzymes, those are at risk of denaturation. We will discuss about in much detail that what we call by skin temperature. The skin has got three basic layers. One is the outer layer, which is called epidermis, which is not vascular. The second one is dermis, which is vascular and connected to the underlying tissues called subcutaneous fat or hypodermis layers. Anybody fatty, they will have a large subcutaneous layer, which is sometimes we call the insulative layer for the human body. The skin has got these 6 basic functions. One, it helps in temperature regulation. Second, it slows down the rate of water loss from the skin surface. It is an important area for all kinds of sensory receptors to send signals to the higher brain. It protects the underlying tissues. It synthesizes different kinds of chemicals. These sites are also important for the excretion of metabolites and other waste in the form of sweats and dripping of water from the skin surface. Let us move on to the skin temperature. The skin temperature is the temperature of the outer surface. When heat generated within the cells of the body and other thermophysical properties of the body, some amount of heat from the inner body, it moves on to the outer surface, and that's called skin temperature. There is not one single site. We call the temperature profile of the skin areas. Left hand side, I have shown a recent recording of infrared thermographic profile of the skin areas. That means the temperature of different areas of the body will have different nature depending upon the tissues present in that, on the exposure, depending upon the bareness and other factors. So, in order to achieve or attain at one level of skin temperature, these sites can be integrated together. That means all the local skin temperatures can be integrated together and arrive at weighted average skin temperature. I have put a picture here which integrates 8 different sites with some coefficient values experimentally determined. If we apply this equation, you will be able to reach the weighted average skin temperature of the body. So we know the internal body temperature, we know the weighted skin temperature. That means that becomes the gradient between the core and the skin, and once the gradient is established, we also know what is the extent of thermoregulation for a particular individual. I have mentioned that when this gradient is taking place, this is between the internal body and external skin surface. Apart from that, there are other external inputs which also contribute to the total heat load of the body. For example, you gain heat from the environment. If the temperature is high, then you get heat. You do some sports activity, your metabolic load is increased, that load is also added to your total heat content of the body, which will raise the body temperature. So, we will discuss about the different routes by which heat exchange can take place. Basically, we are saying that in order to achieve thermoregulation of the body, heat gain must equal to heat loss. The picture I am showing here, it shows that we can vary from 35 degree to 39 degrees centigrade, and the midpoint is 37. When body temperature, let us say at 37 degree, heat gain and heat loss are balanced. There are certain routes by which body can gain heat. There are certain routes by which body can lose heat. The gaining heat can take place by conduction. The first basic 5 routes. First one is conduction, second one is convection, then called thermal radiation or radiation. Fourth one is the metabolic heat production. The sports person will always understand significant amount of heat gets generated in the body in the process of any kind of physical activity. The fifth one, any hot drink or fluid ingested will also add to the total heat load in the body. There are also routes by which heat loss can take place. Conduction, convection, thermal radiation, evaporation, that means sweating, as well as the losing of heat from lungs. You are discharging warm excreta in the form of urine and feces, and also we can ingest cold food or drink. I will individually explain each of these phenomena. First one is conduction. If there is any two objects, there is a difference in the temperature, and if we touch those objects, then there is a possibility that heat will transfer from one object to the other. That means the difference between the two bodies in contact determines the rate of heat loss or gain. A swimmer immersed in the water, he exchanges heat between water and his body. So when he is in water is less hot or cold, then heat is lost from the body to the water. In case of convection, the heat transfer involves several processes. The conduction of heat from solid surface to adjacent fluid particles. Absorption or storage of conducted energy by the particles in raised internal temperature. Movement of higher energy particles to lower temperature regions. The transfer of heat by actual movement of the warm particles. Though lastly, the transport of energy by bulk movement of the fluid. Let us explain a little more different way. Convective loss by air depends upon the wind velocity, because the wind is the air flowing from one direction to the other at different velocities. At up to a certain velocity, we refer to it as a free convection. When velocity is increased, we call it the convection forced. That means positive displacement of fluid produced by some mechanical means. For example, in winter season, higher air velocity allows bulk movement of the air, resulting in feeling of greater coolness. On the left hand side of this slide, I am showing that convective heat exchange depends upon certain coefficient. If the velocity is different, then the convective transfer will also be different. So each level can be determined and we can identify the total heat exchange by convective route. Now let us talk about the thermal radiation. Heat exchange occurs as electromagnetic wave between two opaque bodies, the human body and some external sources. The illustration I am showing here, let us say the solar heat, it comes directly on the human body, it gets diffused and also it gets reflected from the terrain surface. So the entire thermal radiation falls on the human body. A human body can be standing, he can be sitting down, he might be adopting some kind of crouch. That means his surface area exposed to thermal radiation is different. Therefore, depending upon the area that is exposed, the content of heat transfer takes place. Roughly about 77% area gets exposed when somebody is standing. On the other hand, if somebody is in a crouch mode, then his surface area may be at the range of only about 67%. So the total transfer based on the area available for the purpose of transfer. As sports personnel, all of you understand that there is a significant amount of heat gets generated within the body in our metabolic process. When we carry out some sports, when we carry out some mechanical work, when we carry out any other activity, in physical term, some amount of work is done. We can measure it in terms of kilogram meter, we can measure it in terms of watts, in case of joules, we can express this much of mechanical work is performed. But in order to perform that mechanical work, we generate substantial amount of heat which are not totally available for the purpose of mechanical work. Roughly less than 25% of the total energy liberated in metabolic process are utilized for mechanical work, and the remaining large part of the 75% of the energy is either liberated as heat or utilized in maintenance of the body temperature. Human body efficiency of doing work is roughly about 20 to 25%. Heat can also be gained from food. That means if you take high protein diet, there is a release of heat during the digestion process, and this phenomena is known as specific dynamic activity. You can also drink hot fluid, that will also gain heat to the body. If heat gets generated, that gets accumulated in the body. It must be dissipated in order to maintain the balance. Heat gain must be equal to heat loss in order to maintain internal body temperature. Evaporation is the process by which to a significant amount of heat of the body gets transferred to the environment through the skin surface in the form of liquid to vapor. In case of evaporation, there is a change of state from liquid to vapor. In case of convection, we are only talking about the vapor. Or here I am giving an equation which is called the evaporative heat transfer coefficient, that also depends upon the velocity of air in that particular situation. Evaporation, one of the common form is the sweating or dripping of water from the skin surface. 1 gram of sweat requires nearly 500 calories of heat for evaporation. Sometimes the sweating is the sole means of losing heat, depending upon the level of temperature, internal temperature, and the vapor pressure of ambient air or humidity level in the ambient air. There can also be heat loss by respiration and insensible perspiration. When we inhale or exhale, there is always an exchange of heat. Heat from the internal goes out, from external we take in. So depending upon the external temperature or warmth of the air outside, it will determine whether we are taking warm air inside or cold air inside. Similarly, if the internal air is exhaled, it also depends upon the temperature of the inner body or the respiratory system that is coming out. So there is always a convection and evaporative heat loss occurs through respiration, but as well as insensible perspiration that is continuously taking place. If the ambient temperature is less than 25 degree, normally insensible perspiration does not occur, but heat loss by respiration continues. We have to understand that when we inhale air, it gets saturated in the body with water vapor in the lung. So when we exhale, that all that mass with saturated with water vapor also getting transferring to the outside environment. So some amount of heat from the body it is transferring to the ambient environment. We also understand the heat loss can take place through excretion. Any material that is getting excreted from the body in the form of urine or stool, that will also take some amount of heat from the body. If there is an air flow over the body surface, some kind of heat transfer takes place. We always wear some kind of a clothing. The type of clothing worn influences the heat exchange between the ambient environment and human body. Each of them has got different heat exchange rate. That's why type of clothing also determines how much heat transfer can take place. Finally, in summary, I'll explain to you the basic equation how the thermal balance takes place. Here I am expressing M for metabolic energy production, E for heat dissipated through evaporation or sweating, the radiative heat exchange from or to the environment, convective heat exchange from or to the environment, and the work performed by the worker. So if you look at this, the metabolic energy is always positive, evaporation gets negative, radiation and convection can be positive or negative, and work will always be deducted from the total. So if we sum up all these factors, left hand side what we get, then we get a storage, either heat gained or lost by the body. If it is 0, that means the body is in thermal balance. If it is less, then body starts losing temperature. If it is plus, then body temperature will start gaining. So if we take this basic equation into consideration, we will be able to understand or assess whether the body temperature of a person will rise or fall. Now let us move on little more complexity of how body temperature gets regulated. The mechanism of body temperature regulation. Broadly, there are two mechanisms. One called physiological mechanism, that is referred to as endothermy, that is changing the physiological processes of the body like sweating or increasing the metabolic heat production. On the one hand, you increase the heat production, in the other you reduce or increase the loss of heat from the body through sweating. So that's a basic fundamental physiological mechanism for all human being can be observed. The second mechanism is behavioral. We call the behavioral mechanism, ectothermy. That means we can change the behavior of the person. We must have noticed that we can warm up our body by exposing ourselves to the direct sunlight in winter session, or putting on or taking off clothes in order to adjust change. In tropical climate, often we spread our body, we don't crouch. So changing of the posture is also a behavioral mechanism by which the body can regulate temperature. However, neither of these mechanisms can act independently. Both these mechanisms interact and respond to ensure human comfort and survival. I will explain to you the complexity of the components that is involved in the temperature regulation. So we have got certain inputs coming from the external receptors, something going to the higher center, and then the temperature regulation gets maintained. There are different things. As I said, the metabolic functions, hormonal disturbances, everything can add to the total activity of the brain, which are central in nature. There are certain local areas which add to the sweat gland activity. The skin gets wet, and when the skin gets wet, your loss of heat becomes less. There are receptors on the skin surface which sends the signal of the higher center. There are also receptors at the higher center that reciprocates to send the signal to the skin in order to make a balance of the regulation. There are anterior hypothalamus and posterior hypothalamus. In case of anterior hypothalamus, there are receptors which responds to warm signals, hot signals, whereas the posterior hypothalamus, there are receptors that respond to the cold signals. Means in the hypothalamus we have got two types of senses, warm and cold, to send the signal to the external skin surface. So warm must respond to warm, cold must respond to cold receptors of the skin surface. So there should be corresponding sensors at the brain and also to the skin surface. When it warm center gets stimulated, it causes vasodilation. That means more amount of blood can flow through, and as a result there can be increased sweating and body can be cooled down. Cold center stimulation regulates lowering of the body temperature. That means when it gets stimulated, the increased metabolic heat production takes place, blood vessels get constricted, so there is a heat conservation and decreasing in the heat loss. Apart from hypothalamic role, there are many glands like thyroid, adrenal medulla, adrenal cortex. Each of them has a role to secrete certain hormones which also helps in the body temperature regulation. In cold environment, thyroid hormones get secreted which stimulates increasing of the body metabolism. In cold environment also the adrenal medulla gets stimulated and increases the oxidation of foodstuff. In case of adrenal cortex, the adrenal corticoids increases in cold environment. It also helps you in temperature regulation. I have explained to you much detail about the role of the skin. Here I will repeat, the skin surface of the male has less insulation than female skin because the subcutaneous fat in case of males are relatively less than those of females. The subcutaneous area are the source to conserve heat. The extent of skin insulation is useful to increase or decrease the skin temperature without affecting the internal heat gain or loss. Blood can flow into the skin to a great extent to cause changes in the temperature behavior. There are certain basic approaches by which this entire control can take place. In case of say temperature to rise in the body temperature, dilatation of the skin vessels, as I mentioned, that transfers heat from coat to the surface. This causes increase in skin temperature and also reduces the gradient between the environment and the skin. Eventually heat gain is less. Sweating can take place. There can be increased coat temperature and rise in the evaporative heat loss. Approximately one additional 1 degree increase in coat temperature may induce sweating to remove nearly 10 times the basal metabolic rate. It's a very big amount that can be transferred by 1 degree change in the core temperature. 1 degree core temperature rise is not a normal thing, because 37 degree centigrade becomes 38 or 38 degree becomes 39. So 2 degree difference will lead to about 20% change in the total basal metabolic rate. In case of low temperature, the shivering can take place. So there is some amount of chemical thermogenesis takes place by which shivering mechanism is inhibited and in turn will reduce excess heat production. That's one way to make thermal control. There are other responses by which body temperature can be reduced. By vasodilation, sweating, you can increase. By vasoconstriction, you reduce the loss, which will stimulate your posterior hypothalamic pathway to reduce body temperature. Similarly, you have seen situation called piloerection, when the hairs of the skin surface appear goosebump. The sympathetic system gets stimulated and these muscles of the skin follicles gets contracted and the hairs become upright. The thyroxine from thyroid gland, it increases metabolic rate, which we often call it the thermogenesis, that increases basal metabolic rate manifold. Finally, I will discuss to you about the heat acclimatization. Human system is unique, that even in extreme climatic conditions, human beings survive. People go on marathon run in the desert areas, people go in the winter marathon race in the cold environment, mountains, still they can adjust or acclimatize. There are 3 ways we can adapt. One, the short-term change, we call the adjustment. The second one, for a long term, we call acclimatization, or long-term change takes place in the physiological system. Sometimes reversible. Adaptation is a process which is non-reversible, which we find in most of the time in cold acclimatization or cold adaptation. In case of hot environment, we primarily see adjustment and acclimatization. There are 2 aspects of acclimatization. One, called the acclimatization natural. Let's say a human being is in the tropical environment. So he is getting naturally acclimatized to a particular ambient temperature. But for some sports event in some other parts of the world, in our temperate climate, he needs to perform. Then he can be acclimatized by artificial means. In that case, we will not call it as natural acclimatization, we call it as an acclimation. That means we create hypothetical condition in a laboratory environment and we expose person or a sports personnel into that environment for a limited period of time and monitor them whether there is adjustment taking place or not. So I am enclosing a protocol here on the left hand side to show it is a 7-day program. You undertake certain amount of rest in the morning, you see your capacity to do some amount of work, and then you undergo 2 spell of work in a period of 1.5 hours. The second day, your initial part is same, you spread over the work period little longer and still you try to maintain little over 1.5 hours. If this process is continued for 6 to 7 days, one can see change taking place in the duration of exposure and also his ability to adjust to a particular environment. Other protocol, I am also suggesting that those who are on a short duration, let's say to be completed in 4 days, in that case we say that on day 1 you expose only 50% and gradually increase second day to 60% exposure, third day to 80%, fourth day to 100%. You will be able to achieve some amount of acclimatization in the process. If somebody is new or if he is undergoing exposure to a completely different environment, then we suggest that 20% on day 1 and increase by another 20% on the subsequent days. And if we do this, there is a possibility that we decrease the risk of heat related illness. I would end up here saying thank you to all of you for your patient hearing. Thank you.